Ready, set, go. Good morning. I am Ratna Omidvar, Independent Senator from Ontario. I am joined today by Senator Wu from British Columbia and Senator Yussuff from Ontario. We are here today to launch our report on the International Foreign Student Program. We, along with former Senator Sabi Marwa, worked collaboratively to produce this report because we are concerned about the integrity of the program. International students are a major asset to Canada. They contribute $22 billion to our economy. They create 218,000 jobs, and they are a growing part of our labour market pool. Canada set out to increase its share of the market in international students in 2014. Our aim was to double our base, which at that time was 215,000. We have far outrun this goalpost and currently stand at close to 870,000 international students in Canada. This kind of growth does not come with unintended consequences. And in a sense, the program is a victim of its own success. And there are many victims as well, primarily the students themselves, but also the institutions that host them, and of course, our reputation as a global leader in learning. The underbelly of abuse that is prevalent in the system threatens its integrity. And there have been many reports in the media about physical, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. We have come to the conclusion that the systemic underpinnings of this problem lie with the funding arrangement for post-secondary education. Successive governments across Canada have cut grants to institutions to the extent that their only choice now rests with international foreign students as an essential part of their business plan. Today, 100% of net new funding for post-secondary educations in the last 10 years comes from one source and one source only, and that is international foreign students. Fees for international students have grown exorbitantly. Ontario, for example, allows PSCs to raise fees by as much as 20%. At the same time, it has frozen domestic tuition fees. The recruitment of international foreign students through educational and other consultants, either here in Canada or outside of Canada, have become thriving businesses. Private colleges have proliferated with less oversight from the authorities than our public institutions. The incentive to recruit has overtaken any incentive to bring learning-ready students to Canada and provide them with a quality educational experience and decent living. Add to this the withdrawal of our government in the last 30 years from any building of non-market affordable housing, we have a perfect storm. The blaming of international foreign students for these long-standing structural problems, such as in housing, which we have created, it's a bit like the tail wagging the dog. We really have to ask ourselves whether we are going to leave our post-secondary educational institutions at the mercy of external sources of funding. There is no single magic bullet, but we have come together to develop practical solutions. I hand over the podium to my colleague, Senator Wu, to explain some of these solutions.
Thank you all for attending our press conference today. Many of the issues that we've raised in this report are not new, but they have been given prominence in the media recently because of egregious cases of abuse, of false representation, and of course the issue of housing. When we started this study, we were confronted with the realization that this is a multidimensional problem with responsibility spread across many different jurisdictions and also private actors. In some senses, this made it more difficult for us as senators in the federal parliament to tackle the issue. But we decided that the fact that there are disparate interests and disparate responsibility for the challenge of integrity should not be a reason why we do not weigh in and offer some solutions, some recommendations for how to address the multifaceted problems. And so you will see in our report, particularly the recommendations section, that there are some suggestions at the federal level, for example, on the question of letters of authorization, visa issuance, essentially setting national standards. There are some recommendations at the provincial level that have to do with regulation of education, obviously, and the designated learning institutions. And then there are recommendations for the institutions themselves, which, as my colleague Senator Omidvar has pointed out, face a difficult problem of trying to meet their expenses, their ongoing operating expenses, when there is no possibility or very little possibility of increasing fees from domestic students or getting more funding from their provincial sources. All of the burden of meeting the expenses of our post-secondary institutions has fallen on international students. So I invite you to have a closer look at this set of recommendations across the three domains and look forward to taking your questions. Let me now pass to Senator Yussuff for some further comments.
Thank you, Senator Wu. I'm, of course, delighted to be here this morning, obviously, in the context of the report, because I think it's what we're attempting to do is to try to shine a light and said there is a role for the federal government to play in regard to the challenges that we have seen has been reported in the media across the country. We do believe, of course, the federal government have an important role to play. As Senator Omidvar have said earlier in her remarks, that this program represents $22 billion in terms of real contribution to the Canadian economy. And if it's such an important part of the Canadian economy, the question that begs, why don't we have critical standards right across the country to ensure that these students who come to our country can experience, of course, learning in a way that will protect them. We know, of course, the abuse that they're faced with, and we know the finger-pointing that is now happening as a result of housing shortages across the country. I think we have to get beyond that. The federal government do have an important responsibility in its role, because it is the federal government that issued the visa to anybody that wants to come to this country. Our embassies have a critical role in what they do. And some of the things that we believe are critical to the federal government to play is how the government can immediately strengthen the measures that these students can come here and not experience what we have seen reported in the media. Most often, people who come to this country don't know the fundamental way we govern our country. We have rights in this country. We have rights no matter where you may choose to come. Students who come to participate in the program don't come to a province. They come to a place called Canada. That's what they know when they decide they're going to embark on this journey. And we need to protect the brand that Canada is famous for and represents around the world. And what we're seeing in regard to the abuse is this is not going to reflect very well on a province or a particular institution, reflect on the country as a whole. And I think we have to do something in that regard. So the federal government can use its levers through its visa process, that issuing a visa, to allow students to know that they have rights. For instance, employment standard rights if they're going to work in a particular province. They know they have rights from discrimination in a particular province. The Human Rights Code protects all of us as they do in every jurisdiction. The embassy can, of course, alert students regarding whichever province they're going to, what are those rights in their particular jurisdiction. Of course, standards are critical to the integrity of the program. If we don't have standards of how recruiters are going to recruit students, there will continue to be abuse. And when private actors engage in abuse, they should lose their ability to access the visa process that further enriches them. It should not be allowed to continue. Public institutions have a higher standard, we know that, and of course, to a large extent, I think there's a recognition that if they don't abide by their own standards on their own, but I think leaving it to themselves is not good enough. The federal government can bring the province and the territory together to ensure they're doing the right thing. And of course, ensuring the students have proper. I'll conclude, I think, in this regard to say that what we have been seeing reported in the media, if it's allowed to continue, will be a really, I think, a detriment to this program. And for the families who, in many cases, sometimes sell their entire possession to send their loved ones to Canada, this is not a way for us to treat those individuals coming to our country. As a former immigrant myself who came to this country, I recognize fundamentally my own picture in what I see some of these students experience in this country. I think we can do better. We must do better. Over 50% of the international students come to Ontario. The next largest jurisdiction is BC, and the third jurisdiction is Quebec. These three jurisdictions alone represent almost 75% of the total students who come to this country. Certainly the federal government can convene a meeting to say, hey, listen, we're going to act, and we're going to act in a very decisive way. We recognize provincial and territorial government do have responsibility for education, but the federal government have some responsibility to protect the brand of Canada and to ensure abuse will not continue to happen, and put some standards in place will make sure that doesn't happen. So thank you so much.
For whoever, sorry, Peter Mazur, Hill Times, for whoever wants to answer, do we need to admit fewer international students to Canada?
If I may take that question. Capping international students would have a severe impact on the funding of post-secondary institutions. I do not believe that that is the right way to go. The right way to go is to provide for a better student experience, more monitoring, more oversight. We based our ambitions on growing our international foreign student program on Australia, which far outstripped us in 2014. They have a national ombudsman for international students. Their designated learning institutes have a portal where they post the education, the agent's name and qualifications that they work with. We don't do that. Manitoba, because provinces regulate education, Manitoba has set standards for educational consultants. So I think there are things we can do that do not have the downstream impact that I fear would be created for our post-secondary educational institutions without having that bigger, larger national dialogue is on how do we actually want to fund in Canada the learning of our young people. Do we want this learning to be so totally reliant on an external force? I think that's the bigger question than simply cutting back international foreign students.
What about just allowing universities to charge even more and take fewer?
Universities are already charging exorbitant fees to international foreign students. The gap has grown by about 50% at the undergraduate level, I believe, or far more at the graduate level. These are exorbitant prices. I was in India this winter and went to the consular office in Chandigarh, which receives the largest number of visa applications from students. And while I was entering the embassy, there were hosts of families who were lined up waiting for their turn. And they asked, when I talked to them about it, they said, we have sold our farm, we have sold our land, we have sold our property. We want our first child to go to university and then lift us all out of poverty. These are heartbreaking stories when the students come to Canada and they realize that they've been sold a basket of goods that doesn't quite meet what they were told overseas. So there are problems we can solve without cutting back necessarily. I mean, we can talk about higher standards. We can talk about dispersing the students better across the country. There are other things we can do, I believe.
Can I jump in on that, Ratna? First of all, the gap between domestic fees and international fees, it's in the report. I think it's 1 to 5 now for the undergraduate level, 1 to 5, and in the graduate level, I think it's 1 to 2. So very, very substantial. The question of how many international students come in is ultimately a function of the system we set up and the attractiveness of our education system. Unambiguously, we believe international students are good for this country. We want to see more of it happen. But if we have a system that does not promote and practice integrity, does not protect the integrity of the students' experience, there will be a natural decline anyway, because students, the word will get back to sending countries that the education experience in Canada is not the bill of goods that they were sold. So it's really important for us not to focus on the cap, but to focus on the system, which is what Senator Omidvar was getting at. Focusing on the system means doing the things that Senator Yussuff talked about. Screening, informing students at the beginning of the process of their rights and privileges, making sure that institutions do not abuse their right to hire students, ensuring that institutions are not solely reliant on foreign students for their operating expenses. And then after they arrive, making sure that the education experience is, in fact, what was offered in the advertisement. We have seen stories of students who thought they were coming here to do a particular course and found that the program was switched after they arrive, leaving them very much in the lurch. So we'd like to, once again, as my colleagues have said, focus on systemic problems rather than on the simple question of a cap.
When you talk about abuse, what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, there's a variety of abuse have been reported in the media, from sexual abuse of students, people exploiting them because they believe they're vulnerable in the context as, you know, they're here in the visa system. There's workplace abuse in the context of working for employers and, of course, not knowing what their rights are and how they're going to protect those rights in the context of employment. And, of course, the other abuse, which we've been seeing more and more, of course, are the housing challenges. People living in conditions that are simply not acceptable, and of course those who are landlords and are renting to these young students in our country, what would they do about it? Who do they complain to about that? And I think these are basic things in a democratic society we should govern, and it should not be less for an international student than it is for Canadians in general. But the reality is, when you're dependent on a visa to remain in this country, you're very vulnerable. And recognizing these are very young people, and sometimes necessarily not knowing what their rights are, the state has an important role to play, both at the provincial level, the municipal level, and the national level. And we need to ensure adherence to a set of values that represent this country, and more importantly, represent the fact and how we made it possible for these students to come here. They came to Canada with an understanding they would be treated fairly and be given an opportunity to get a decent education. So I think it's critical that the government recognize this will only get worse, especially when there's a proliferation on private education system that are growing in the country. These are not about the public institutions, but the private system that doesn't adhere to common standards that we can say this will represent what Canada is trying to promote internationally.
I'm just asking a question because I work for the French media, and we're looking about francophones coming from other countries to study. Was that taken in consideration in the report?
Yes, the report, if you look at it, there is a breakdown of the source countries, and I think it will give you a listing, and some of those source countries are francophone countries in which students are coming from.
But is there a way to help the universities that welcome those francophone countries? Yeah.
I think, again, universities that are tracking francophone students have a responsibility to ensure they can communicate them in their own language, French in that case, but also provide, as most jurisdictions can, an understanding what their basic rights within those province and territory which they're going to reside in and get their education.
We've heard stories about so-called diploma mills, small private colleges, and the role that they play in all of this. In your work producing your report, did you notice a particular difference between the culpability, for lack of a better word, that, say, universities or large established colleges have versus some of these private institutions?
Because of the nature of a private institution, it is naturally, I believe, it has less oversight than public institutions. Private institutions have proliferated. I'm not saying all private colleges are bad. I am sure some provide a good quality education, but the anecdotal evidence suggests that there are many private colleges that are fly-by-night. They open up in strip malls. Their enrollment of foreign students far exceeds their capacity. Sometimes private colleges partner with public institutions, and there is revenue sharing, so to say, without necessarily ensuring a quality education for the students. Again, these are anecdotes. You've heard about the 700 students who got a false, whose letter of authorization was falsified. They face the consequences of this whole lack of oversight and accountability in the system.
Well, now, is it on, Eric? We'll now take question online, please. If you have a question, please activate the raised hand function. We don't have questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all. You were great. Thank you. You all are natural.